You're listening to the 36th broadcast of TBR Radio's, the TBR History Hour, with your host, TBR contributing editor, Dr. Edward DeVries. On today's show, Dr. Ed talks with fellow TBR contributor, Clint Lacy. Clint submitted an excellent article that appears in the September-October issue of The Barnes Review. Slavery in the Words of Slaves was a compilation of interviews conducted in the 1930s with former slaves who were living in the Ozark Mountains.
I noticed as I was reading your article on slavery in the words of slaves that appears in the current issue of the Barnes Review magazine, that the people who were being interviewed for this article were all people who lived probably within a few miles of where you live. If my memory serves, at one time you had told me that Cape Girardeau, Missouri was about 30 miles from your home, and I see a couple people from Cape Girardeau, Missouri. I see someone from Festus, Missouri who was interviewed. There was another person who was interviewed from Arkansas, obviously still in the Ozark area. And so, what was your source for these interviews? Because the Slave Chronicles, for example, had people who came from all over America. And, all of these seem to be in a very tight geographical area that you live in the center of. So what was your source material, and, maybe what was your motivation to pick the people who you picked to, I know you didn't interview them personally, but, you picked the transcripts of their interviews and so forth. Kind of let us into that process a little bit.
Well, in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, they had a program called the Works. I believe it was WPA, and it stood for Work Prog. And they put out a volume of slave interviews called the Slave Narratives, and they had one for each slaveholding state. So I was doing an expanded second edition of Blood in the Ozarks, and as well as I know that whenever Southern heritage is portrayed in the media, slavery always comes up, and it's always the excuse that the media uses to say that the South fought this war. And so I wanted to pick out some interviews from the slave narratives that told an opposing story, and several of them did. Matter of fact, a lot of them would say that the Confederates treated them a lot better than the Yankees. Matter of fact, one of them in particular said them browncoats, which he's referring to Confederates, because a lot of them wore what they called butternut uniforms, homemade. They would come in and eat your stuff on the farm, but they said them blue coats were worse. They'd eat everything you got, make you cook it for them, and eat it right in front of you. And a lot of them just talked about harsh treatment by the Yankees. And there's even a couple examples. One in particular, one gentleman was saying that his daddy went to war with his master and said he was a soldier. So that would have meant he was a black Confederate, which they also say doesn't exist. And within these narratives, there's social commentary, too, about how some of the slaves felt after the war. Some of them actually said that they was better off in slavery days, and some said that the younger generation didn't want to work. They only, if they wanted to work, they wanted something easy, basically. And there was work available for them, but they didn't want to do the hard work, like working in the fields or the quarries or things of that nature. And one former slave in particular was talking about how the younger generation was out of control. Now, that's in the 1930s, and they felt like they were out of control then. I can imagine what they would think of today's society and everything that's going on right now. And it really serves as a defense of the South and the Confederacy. So I wanted to put that in the book to further reinforce my beliefs in the theme of the book that the South really was the victim here.
And, there were some interesting things that you talked about in your article. For example, the cakewalk.
They thought it was funny when their masters would have big parties and invite other people over, and it was real formal events. And the servants and the slaves, they thought it was kind of funny, the pomp and circumstance surrounding it. So they would hold their cakewalk, as they called it, to kind of poke fun of the masters, and the masters knew about it and laughed with them about it. They thought it was funny too. So even back then, they were allowed to make fun of each other. There wasn't this bitter hatred that the media portrays there was, and that many of them had really good relationships with their masters. Nobody's saying slavery was right, but what I am saying is a lot of them had very good relationships with their masters. They were considered part of the family. A lot of the time, their masters would take them to church, and even after the war, a former slave in particular was talking about how people were starving. A lot of black families were starving, and if the whites heard about a family starving, they would go and take them food, help them out. Several former masters deeded 10 or 20 acres and a cabin to their former slaves so that they might have a start in being self-sustaining and being able to be independent and make a living for themselves. So, this wasn't a case of one race being supreme over another. A lot of them had an affection for each other.
Well, even like the cakewalk, the prize of the cakewalk was that these slave couples would be able to go home with cakes. A lot of times their masters would, when they did the cakewalk, whoever they thought did like the funniest impersonation of them, they would let them take home, cakes and different things. And so,
the masters had their pomp and circumstance and their formal affairs, and the cakewalk was the party. It was a party they allowed the slaves to have. Yeah. And that was how they socialized.
Well, another fact that gets brought out in your article is that there were 8 million white people in the South.
Mm-hmm.
There were 27 million white people in the United States, and 8 million of those lived in the southern states.
Mm-hmm.
But yet, the slave owners nationwide, because there were slaves in some of the northern states as well. And so the slave owners nationwide, in a country of 27 million white people, was 385,000.
Yeah.
And not all of those slave owners were in the North. But even if you were to say that all 385,000 of those slaveholders were in the South, which would not be true, but if you were to say that, you could only get 4.8% of Southern whites as being slave owners, which would mean that 95.2% of Southern whites did not own slaves. I mean, that's a pretty significant number.
Yeah. And if you look at Missouri, that number is even lower.
Yeah.
I believe 2% were slave owners.
Yeah. Plus, you got to remember that there were black people that owned slaves as well, and so that would cut that number even more.
And that's true. And if you look at Missouri, a lot of the most prominent unionists in the state were slave owners. They sided with the union because they thought their quote-unquote property would be better protected if they did. It's not so cut and dry as people think. I think of the Confederate Army, 86% of Confederate soldiers didn't own a single slave. Many of them weren't much better off financially than many of the slaves. And it's like the old story where a Yankee's talking to a captured Confederate, and he looks at his condition. I think everybody's heard the story. But he looks at the condition of this Confederate. He said, I know you can't own slaves. Why are you fighting? Why are you fighting for slavery? And he said, I'm not. I'm fighting because you're down here. That is the real reason the majority of them fought for the South, was to protect their homes and their property and their families. And we know, looking back historically, that they were right to do so because, there was an older gentleman in our SCV camp. We had a meeting Saturday. He was talking about when Bloomfield, Missouri was captured and occupied by the Yankees, General Grant gave an order that, no personal property was supposed to be disturbed. Anything taken, they were supposed to get vouchers for. And the first thing the Yankees did was ignore that order and just start taking everything. So even Yankee leaders who tried to prevent that were unable to prevent it. And then you had the Yankee leaders who actively encouraged it. Very vindictive, very, some of them were just complete psychopaths. So if you look at it, either way you want to cut it, the majority of Confederates didn't own slaves. They weren't fighting for slavery. And their decision to join the Confederate Army was justified when you look at how they were treated as the Northern armies made their way south.
Open your web browser and type in www.barnesreview.org and discover the Barnes Review magazine. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There is no more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review magazine in its print form, or in convenient electronic delivery. Our host has been a subscriber to both formats for years. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
So you had said in the introductory comments in your article that social justice organizations do not want the public to know that an unlikely defense of the Confederacy exists in the words of former slaves. And this is a partial retelling of their story in their own words with few corrections made to grammar or dialect. Everything that we're reading in the rest of your article is going to be basically, slaves in their own words, explaining how the Confederacy and Southern people weren't the evil institutions that modern day commentators would tell us that they are.
Yes, that's correct. As a matter of fact, there's kind of an enlarged quote in the middle of one of the pages of the article, and it was exactly what I was describing to you a few minutes ago, where when I told you once the slaves were freed, a lot of them were starving, and one slave said some of the white folks was mighty good to them, the former slaves. If they heard of a family being hungry, they'd send food to them. Okay, so this isn't one group of people who hated the other.
Right.
This is one group of people who are empathetic to the other. So, and like I said, a lot of times they would deed part of their land off to them, and they would deed part of their land off to them, and a cabin or whatever, and help them get started on hopefully making themselves independent. So hatred was not even involved in all of this.
And so the first person that you interviewed the first person that was interviewed by Irene Robertson, who was the person, back in the 1930s who was doing this interview. And the person she was interviewing was Silas Abbott, who was age 73 and who lived in Brinkley, Arkansas. And he kind of begins by saying, I was born in Chickasaw County, Mississippi. Ellie Abbott and Maggie Abbott was our owners. They had 3 girls and 2 boys, Eddie and Johnny. We played together till I was grown. I loved them like if they was brothers. Papa and Massa Ellie went to war together in a 2-horse top buggy. They both came back when they got through. There was 8 of us children, and none was sold, none was give away. My parents named Peter and Mahaley Abbott. My father was never sold, but my mother was sold into this Abbott family for a house girl. She cooked and washed and ironed. She was a wet nurse. She tended Eddie and Johnny and me all alike. She'd whoop them when they needed, and Miss Maggie would whoop me. That's the way we growed up. And so, it sounded very much like... in this case, they were very integrated into the family that owned them.
Yeah, and that's what I was saying. That, there was a very, they were almost like family members. Just because you could own slaves, there was kind of an unwritten moral obligation that, you were supposed to take care of them, supposed to treat them well. And and they all grew up together. Whichever parent saw the other, caught the children doing wrong, they disciplined them, and they had open license to do that. So they all grew up together. They were all close, and these bonds were formed then, and they carried over after the war.
And so he made mention that his grandfather was a soldier in the war. So obviously, again, that those black Confederates that weren't supposed to exist. And then he talks about how after the war, his parents stayed there on the master's farm, and his uncle stayed on, and how the masters gave the uncle a home and 20 acres of ground, and also gave his parents a home and 20 acres of ground so that they could run a gin.
Yeah, and somebody burnt the gin. I don't remember if they ever found out who it was, but yeah, the master did try to give him a good start. And this wasn't uncommon. A lot of times after the war, if a former slave who'd just been freed didn't have any place to go or anything to do, they would ask to stay on the farm and help. And they were allowed to do so, And there's examples of that in this article.
And so then he talked about how when he grew up, how he went to Arkansas and got a job on the railroad and basically helped build the railroad all the way to its terminal point in Memphis. And, I guess made enough money that he was able to buy a house.
Yeah, and this same gentleman, he's one of them that says, and I'll quote from the article, he says, "Times is so changed and the young folks different. They won't work only enough to get by, and they want you to give them all you got. They take if they can. Nobody's got time to work. I think times is worse now than they've ever been because folks hate to work so bad. I'm talking about hard work, field work. Jobs young folks want is scarce. Jobs they could get, they don't want. They want to run about and fool around and get by. I get $8 in provisions from the government a month." So this is a problem we see today. And I would say this is the source of the problem for all of the Black Lives Matter participants, most of whom are white, who are looking for some kind of social cause. They don't want to work. Obviously, they don't want to work because if they had a job, they would not have time to riot and loot. And, it's getting to be a shooting war now. But it's all because these people, like this former slave said, they want you to give it everything you got to them. They think it's owed to them. So this is a man that saw this back in the 30s and recognized what was going on and the way it was going. And we see that problem has carried over into the new millennium, and it's caused greater problems. So it's my personal belief that the communists, who are largely backed by George Soros, they're bankrolling all this, and they're using these people to wreak havoc. And the majority of these people that don't want to work today and want to riot, they don't even have any idea that they're just pawns. They're being used. They're under the impression they're fighting for some kind of social justice, civil rights reform, but they're just revolutionaries.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes you wonder what it would have been like had the South would have won. Had we remained, would we have remained a country of our own? Would we have reunited with the North? If so, even if we reunited, it just makes you wonder if some of these traditional values would have been preserved and protected. I don't have the answer to that, but it makes me wonder.
Well, I could be wrong, obviously, but Massachusetts had seceded a few times well before the war. At the time of the Louisiana Purchase, for example, Massachusetts had seceded. I don't remember the exact words, but something to the effect of they did not want to be in union with Cajuns, Creoles, and half-breeds.
Well,
but yet they call Southerners racists.
And that goes to the problem today. All the liberals tell you to wear a mask. You must wear a mask. You must. They're the same ones having parties, going to music awards, not wearing a mask. But that's because they believe they're so superior to us. Yeah. And we are all just peasants. And they know so much more. Therefore, they know what's best for us. So they're supposed to tell us what to do, and we're supposed to listen. Well, it was no different in the 1850s and 60s. They still felt like they were morally superior. But I have to say, that has no basis, no grounds, because the Northeast was built with slave labor. It was only when the North industrialized that they decided they did not have any use for slaves. And even then, Rhode Island and Massachusetts were major markets for building slave ships. So everything from then to now, the attacks on our monuments, the rioting in the cities, the calls for social justice, it's all based on a lie.
But those states that seceded, even before the war between the states, they came back.
Yes.
And I have no doubt that had there not been a war, that the Confederacy may have existed for months, maybe even a few years. But I think at some point, you would have seen a reunification.
And
it would have been negotiated politically, and it would have been in the best interest of both countries. The country would have been a lot better off because of it, and instead it's been worse off for the last 150 some years.
Well, I don't remember who made the quote. It was a Southern leader, or Southern general, and I wished I could remember the source of the quote. But basically it went like this: we're fighting for the Constitution as it is, and not for the one they want to change it into. In other words, they believe the states should retain the majority of the power, that the federal government should be very limited, only have power over certain jurisdictions and subjects. And if you look at the way things are now, there's a lot of laws that Christian Southerners, Christians in general across the country don't agree with. But the way these laws get passed in each state is, after the war, the federal government became the lone authority. The states were subservient to the federal government. So what does the federal government do if they want a state to pass a law in which the people disagree with? Well, all of that money that all the taxpayers pay from across the country, north, south, east, to west, it goes in one big giant pile, and they have to fight over it now. And if they want a state to pass a law and the state doesn't agree with, the first thing they say, that the federal government says, is, okay, that's fine, we'll just withhold your federal road money. And so the law gets passed. The war between the states, war, northern aggression, civil war, whatever you want to call it, it made the federal government a bully. And if you want to break it down in the simplest of terms, if this was a schoolyard fight, the South was a kid that was standing up to a bully, and the bully was Uncle Sam.
And that's a good way to put that.
But what we're seeing now, somebody disagreed with me on this. I made a comment on a Facebook post. I said, look, the reason they went after our monuments first is they see us responsible for electing Trump. And Hillary was supposed to be the one that won the election of 2016. They thought they had it rigged well enough she would win. They didn't count on so many people being fed up. And they didn't count on candidate Trump. And so these people blame the South for electing Trump. So they went after our monuments first, but
extra, read all about it. If you're like me, and I'll bet you are, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
Extra, extra, read all about it.
There were 45 items on a communist agenda this paper was investigated in Congress in the 60s. And one of the items was remove all artistic monuments that hold meaning and artistic value and replace them with ugly, meaningless monuments. Isn't that's what's going on right now?
Well, here in Salisbury, you ought to see the monument that just got erected the other day. It's like they just took a piece of rock and stuck it in the middle of a flower bed and put a sign in front of it.
Yeah, well, and if you drive through Cape Girardeau now, there's all these abstract statues that just look like twisted pieces of metal or whatever that are ugly and have no meaning. And what happened in June? They removed the Confederate monument in Cape, which several of us went up there and protested and tried to draw attention to it. And he was actually a black reporter with the TV station who called me, and this whole thing all started. It was pre-planned. I mean, it's obvious, but it's a very Antifa-looking girl, BLM type girl. She went on the news saying how that monument was originally placed at the foot of the old bridge on the Missouri side to warn blacks coming into Missouri. Which, that was the furthest thing from the truth. A lot of these monuments were erected as symbols of peace and reconciliation. But that reporter, they sent him to interview her, and the next week he wanted to interview me, and he probably spent 20 minutes interviewing me, and we spent an hour on the phone with each other. And the man really, truly, honestly wanted to let us tell our side of the story. And after the cutting room editors got done with it, I was aired for about 5 seconds. So, and I let everybody know, look, it wasn't this reporter's fault. I talked to him at length. He really did want to give us a fair shake. But his superiors took care of that. And a matter of fact, the girl that started a petition to remove the monument, her father is, I believe, the head of the creative department at the station. So there's no secret. There's no wondering why she got so much airtime, and they gave me 5 seconds. But my SCV camp is working on trying to retain ownership of this monument at the time. We feel like if we can just achieve ownership of it, then we can find a place to put it that where it will be safe and receive the honor that it deserves.
You know, it just blows my mind, all of the activity that's coming out against Confederate monuments right now. But what people don't realize is that there's a far greater agenda that's going on, even than the one that they see. Because you would think that, in the middle of a pandemic, why is the government pushing to have protests and, statues and cultural icons being violently torn down? And in other words, why is this an agenda in the middle of what is supposed to be a global health crisis? In other words, there's another agenda that's actually going on, and what we're seeing, be it COVID-19, be it the desecration of monuments, be it Black Lives Matter, be it cities like Kenosha, Wisconsin burning to the ground. Those are all just small pieces of an overall bigger picture that none of us are seeing yet.
Well, yeah, and I think part of the reason for that is a lot of people still get their news from the television or established media networks. Well, you're not going to get the truth there. You have to dig deeper. You have to find news sources that you trust, that do their due diligence and are honest about the news, and they will tell you. They will tell you all about George Soros. How he was a Jew who turned in other Jews. He said that in a 60-minute interview during World War II. I don't remember if it was in Poland or Czechoslovakia, but they asked him why he did that. And he said, well, there was a stigma with being a Jew. So that's how he justified it. He turned in other people of his own race and got them killed. And that tells you right there the man is a psychopath. And his intentions are pure evil. And he's imploded the economies of several governments. He's overthrown several governments. And now he's working on trying to implode the economy of our country and implode our government. And the way they do this is they fund these groups like Antifa and Black Lives Matter to go out and create as much anarchy and chaos as possible. And I believe they're really trying to push the people of this country into a war against each other. And they've gotten pretty close. I mean, there was a man killed in Portland. He was with a group called what's the name of that? Patriot Prayer Group or something. And him and a couple of other guys got isolated from a larger group, and the BLM and Antifa people chased after him in a parking garage, and one of them unloaded his gun into one of the Patriot Prayer people, killed him. And of course, there's an Antifa girl. You have to search for these videos because you're not going to see them on the news, but she basically said, we killed a Nazi today, and I don't feel bad about it. And we know after the events of Charlottesville that anybody that tried to defend themselves or another person from these hordes, they got the full extent of the law thrown at them. They got locked in prison and the key thrown away. But the people on the other side that assault our people and who are now killing our people, nothing seems to be done about that. And the incident in Wisconsin where the 17-year-old kid ended up, I believe, killing two of his attackers. First of all, I don't really think a 17-year-old kid should be in that situation. However, I believe he worked in that city in Wisconsin. And earlier that day, he was helping clean graffiti up. And during the riot, he had his medical bag and was patching people up on both sides. One guy attacked him with a skateboard, tried to beat him up with that. He shot him, and I can't remember if it was the same guy with the skateboard or not, but another guy, you won't see this on the news, but he had a pistol and pulled on the kid, so the kid took him out, took the third one out. And he had to do that to survive. But this poor kid's going to get the full extent of the law thrown at him. And I can bet you anything, the guy that had the pistol that was charged, he won't receive, well, I guess he won't have to receive anything because that problem's been taken care of.
Well, to show you how wicked our system is, okay, this kid's 17 years old, so he's not an adult.
Right.
And so they can throw the full extent of the law against this kid. A judge is going to declare him to be an adult.
Yes. And then
now a judge can say he's an adult till he's blue in the face. He's still a 17-year-old kid. And so to declare this kid to be an adult, the judge has to assume the power of God.
Yes.
And the judge is going to usurp the power of God just so that he can crucify a 17-year-old kid. And that's how wicked the United States of America is today.
Welcome to the Christendom Curriculum. You know, every parent who decides to homeschool wants to secure a great education for their child, while also saving time and money. But these days, many parents have another concern. They also want a homeschool curriculum without all the multiculturalist, politically correct diversity doctrine that's really little more than a thin disguise for an anti-Christian, anti-American, and anti-Western civilization bias. Now there is such a curriculum. The Christendom curriculum gives your children a complete education in Bible, history, literature, and more, focusing on the classic academic skills of reading, writing, and arithmetic. But we also tell the story of Christendom, the story of the Christian nations, especially as Christ's kingdom has been historically manifest in the nations of Europe and America, and we do so without apology. The Christendom curriculum is the only Christian nationalist homeschool program you'll find. We support the right of the European and American peoples to their historic Christian cultures against the globalist leftists who want to destroy those cultures. Not only that, but we provide assigned reading courses for various hot-button subjects in our current culture wars, including feminism, social justice, and cultural Marxism, among others. These reading courses will teach your kids how to survive a social justice warrior attack, how to debate with leftists on social media, how to reform their local churches and communities, and more. We're living in a time of tremendous historical and social change. Christians have the opportunity now to begin building the culture and civilization of the next 1,000 years and beyond. It's an exciting time to be alive. So if you want to help raise the next generation of culture warriors, if you want your children to grow up with a love for Christ's kingdom and for their own nation, while at the same time learning how to defend America and rebuild the West, the easy-to-use Christendom curriculum is for you. Click the Learn More button to get in on the action. And thanks for listening.
Well, it's not only that, Dr. Ed, but there's videos floating around, and they're real. And you see these BLM and Antifa members, they're burning flags now. They're burning Bibles. And I think that tells you everything you need to know about them. And they act like a people that are possessed, and it's my belief they are possessed. They are possessed. And a lot of members of the Democratic Party are possessed. Liberalism has been their religion all along. That's why facts don't matter to them. But they're not even hiding it anymore. You know, liberalism is their religion, but their God is Satan. And they're doing Satan's work. And, I mentioned getting back to the slaves, find what his name was. He was from Festus, Missouri. The interviewer was unknown, and his name was Joe Casey. And he talked about how his father went to fight the war. And he didn't say whether he was Confederate or Union. But he said shortly after the war, he came back and died because he was sick. But he was making a commentary about the 1930s. I believe it's in the 30s. I don't have the date of the interview on there. And it's almost prophetic what he says. He says, I don't know what I think about the young Negroes today. They're all shined up, going around. If they can read and write, they ought to know the difference between right and wrong. I don't think they will amount to much. Some of them ain't got no sense. My mother would not let me stay out. Now that is all they are doing. Last night the policeman put a knot on my boy's head. He was drinking and got into it with a coon. Now he's not talking about a raccoon, but right. That's his way of describing a black person that didn't have much discipline or morals. Said the young colored people is fighting all the time. I don't get out. I just go to the store and come back home again. There's a house right near here where they have a big time every night. The whites and black ones was mixed up here till I stopped it. He stopped it. He says right down in that hall. I'll bet you'll find 1/3 of the white women living with black men. Most all the colored people around here is working in the works here at Crystal City. They will get up a war here if they keep on. You just watch, just like they did in Illinois. He's talking about East St. Louis when they burn up a heap of coons. That's his words, not mine. It's liable to get worse the way things are going. Well, that came true. Ali, it's not just the blacks; it's the blacks and the whites. And the majority of whites, the majority of the members in Black Lives Matter are white.
Well, I went just out of curiosity. They were having a Black Lives Matter protest at the university, which is close enough that I decided, well, I'm going to drive down there and I'm going to watch this protest, or at least I'm going to see what's going on over there, you know. And it was a couple of hundred white kids and one black kid.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the Black Lives Matter protest. And the black kid, you know, kind of looked like maybe he, he was the only one who didn't have a sign. He was the only one who, I almost wonder if maybe he wasn't even a spectator.
Well, and that's the thing. These liberal white kids have taken it upon themselves to defend the blacks.
Mm-hmm.
Did the blacks ask them to do that?
Yeah.
You know,
because I never got out of my truck, so I couldn't hear any of the conversations that were going on.
But
so I wonder if the black kid wasn't, a newspaper reporter or a spectator of some kind. And
well, most of these events, if you look, they're mostly white. There's very few black people in them, and that's why I say these kids don't realize they're not working for any kind of social justice. They're being used to create anarchy.
Yeah.
Their actions are actually harming black people, harming everybody, because they don't realize their pawns.
Yeah. But you talk about this poor kid in Wisconsin. There was somebody who works in the governor's office in Maryland, and he put out a tweet or a Facebook post on I think it was Friday night, maybe it was Saturday night, last week. And basically he said something to the effect of that he was glad to see that there were some conservative people who were coming to the support of this kid, because he seems like he's a good kid and, he's probably going to need the help. That's all he said.
Let me guess, they crucified him.
Yeah, well, apparently he was fired within minutes of that going on, Facebook or Twitter or whatever social media place it was posted. Within minutes, he was fired. And a statement was made from the governor's office to CNN. And they fired him on CNN. Nobody bothered to call the guy. The guy doesn't even watch CNN. On Sunday, he gets a call from the Washington Times or the New York Times, and they were asking him about it, and he didn't even know he was fired. So the reporter referred him to CNN's website, where he could see the interview of him being fired from the governor's office. And he watched that, and then gave an interview to the Times reporter, basically to the effect that, he had no idea. He had never been called into the office. He never received a phone call. He never received an email. I mean, basically, they just fired him on CNN.
Yeah, well, it doesn't surprise me a bit.
Yeah.
If you want to talk about civil rights, it's our civil rights that are being violated.
And he didn't say anything that, and, of course, the CNN interview, they were talking about how this man's racist social media posts and how they can't tolerate that. Literally, all he said was that he was glad that there was a lawyer and a few conservatives that were going to support this kid, in his upcoming court cases.
Yeah, well,
I mean, he
said
nothing.
Somebody set up a GoFundMe account for this kid, and it got terminated. But I believe the lawyer who defended the Covington, Kentucky students and Nick Sandman against the libel that was made against him, and won, by the way.
Right.
He is.
And Nick Sandmann, he was the one who had discovered the bomb at the Olympics in Georgia, and then, of course, the FBI tried to make it out like he was a domestic terrorist who was going to blow the whole place up.
Well, I can't remember that guy's name. That wasn't Nick.
Oh no, Nick Sandmann was the Covington, Kentucky kid.
Yeah. But Clint Eastwood made
the same lawyer. I think the Georgia case was his name William Jewell.
Yes, that's correct. That's his.
Yeah, he was the security guard who found the bomb at the Olympics, and of course, then a few days later, the FBI tried to say that, well, he was the terrorist. He had planted the bomb, and but yeah, the same lawyer had defended both, and the same lawyer is also agreeing to defend the poor kid in Wisconsin.
Yes, and if I'm not mistaken, that same lawyer is black.
Okay, I did not know that.
I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure he is. And
okay,
you talk about William Jewell. Clint Eastwood made an entire movie about it, and pretty much any movie Clint Eastwood makes is a hit. But they panned that movie, they suppressed it. If they couldn't keep him from making the movie, they were sure going to do their best to suppress it.
Right.
Because they don't want the truth out. And it really is, if you put this in the simplest terms, what we're seeing today is a fight between good and evil. There's no other way to break it down except that. And it's all around us. We all know people who are going through things. And it just seemed like it just happened all of a sudden, just bam. So, yeah, good people are under attack.
Hello, I'm Tom Strain, Lieutenant Commander-in-Chief of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. The Confederate flag, Confederate symbols, and the reputation of our Confederate ancestors has come under attack. The Sons of Confederate Veterans is actively fending off our detractors, but there is only so much that we can do. We need your help. Contact your local, state, and national elected politicians and tell them that you will not tolerate these attacks on our heritage. You can also visit scv.org, download an application to join us in our fight to preserve our Southern heritage. Visit scv.org today. If you don't have a Confederate ancestor and you are tired of American history disappearing, you can assist us by becoming a friend of the SCV. Please visit scvheritagedefense.org and make a donation to the Heritage Defense Fund. We hope that you will join us in the fight to defend the Confederate soldiers' good name.
There was another interview that you did, or that you reported here in your article, and the interviewer was Thomas Elmore Lucy, and the person interviewed was Nellie James, who at the time was age 72, living in Russellville, Arkansas. And she said that they called her Aunt Nellie, and she tells the story how she was born in Mississippi just after the war had closed, and so about a year or so after the war had closed, and so she was not technically born into slavery, but both of her parents were. And so she talks about how her parents had told her how well they were treated as slaves. And she also, basically talks about how she didn't see the need to vote. And, she had become a missionary Baptist. Her husband, I guess, was an educator. And he was the headmaster of one of the largest schools for black kids there in Arkansas. And so not only did he see to it that a lot of these former slaves, got an education, but also even like their own son had become a medical doctor and, had moved to Chicago and made a very good life for himself. And, I guess kind of clue us in on that interview just a little bit.
Well, not only that, but she said, as far as I remember from what my parents said, the master was reasonably kind to all his slaves. And my husband said the same thing about his own master. Although they was quite young at the time, they were freed. So both her mother and her father stated that their masters were kind to them. And then she marries a guy who becomes an educator, like you said, and oversees one of the largest schools for black children in Arkansas. But this kind of goes on, kind of ties in with the interview of the former slave from Festus. She says, I think the young people of both races are growing wilder and wilder. Their parents today are too slack and racing, too lenient. I don't know where they're headed, what they mean, what they want to do, or what to expect of them. And I'm too busy and have too hard a time trying to make ends meet to keep up with their carrying on. So she noticed the same thing that the gentleman in Festus noticed, that the kids of both races, the next generation, if you will, their parents were too lenient on them. They were growing wilder. Nobody was there to discipline them, keep them in check. And she has serious misgivings about the future.
And the interviewer made a note that she was a quiet, refined woman, a good housekeeper, and has reared a large and successful family. She speaks with good, clear diction and has none of the brogue that is characteristic of the colored race of the South.
Yeah. In other words, she was saying she was educated.
Right.
And she carried herself well. She was an upstanding person. And there's a lot of examples of this, And but what liberals...
But remember now, when Joe Biden said that Barack Obama was handsome and articulate, that didn't sound like a black person at all, he was a racist. And so no doubt the person who interviewed Nellie James was a racist too.
That's how the media would portray it today, yeah. But liberals, they don't want you to know that a lot of these former slaves went on to do fairly well for themselves, were educated, made good lives for themselves, were upstanding, lived independent lives for themselves, because the liberals, they want you to believe that even today that these people don't have a chance, or they must be dependent on the government. Of course, it goes to all races, but they focus on the blacks. And I think one of the real treasures or jewels of these interviews is you'll find that these people were slaves and whose masters treated them fairly well, who helped them after the war, and they went on to become independent, on their own, and thrive, and have good reputations, and become educated. And they did that on their own. They didn't need anybody, any political party. They didn't need their handouts or any of the things that liberals today say that they need to survive. If anything, a lot of the blacks and minorities today, I can't remember the author's name. She was a black woman. Probably in the early 2000s, she wrote a book called Uncle Sam's Plantation. And she went into great detail about, how the government has made these people dependent on them, on their plantation now. I guess you could say one big plantation. They want them dependent on them. But in these interviews, you see people that went through a lot. But also you see former slaves who will tell you that they not only suffered, but the family of the master suffered too. They all suffered together at the hands of an invading Union army. And so the reason I wanted to put that in the expanded second edition of Blood in the Ozarks is because it goes to show a recurring theme here that, there was a real hatred for Southerners by a lot of the Union Army. And like I said, when the masters suffered, the slaves suffered too. They all suffered. Like one said, that the bluecoats would come in and eat everything you got, make you cook it for them, eat it right in front of your face, knowing you weren't going to have anything to eat. So there's a lot of truth in these interviews, a lot of really good truth, and I hope people read it and that it opens their eyes, because it doesn't get much more accurate than the words of the slaves, of the former slaves, and it disputes everything people today are taught about this period of time. So, if you want the truth, go to the source. And the source in this article, it's the words of the former slaves.
Yep. And, one of the slaves you had interviewed, her name was Betty Brown from Cape Girardeau, Missouri, and it was a very short interview. But you had quoted her as basically saying that, her family and the master's family was just one big family. And that when the war was over, they stayed because they had nowhere else to go. And, the master's family wasn't kicking them out.
Right. Yeah. She said we lived in a little log house and they were allowed to stay there after they were free.
And I'm going to guess that the master wasn't really that wealthy of a person either. She talks about them living in a, like a double house. I don't know. Was it a double wide, trailer? I don't know. I'm joking there. But, but she doesn't describe it as like a big stately mansion or plantation house. And so I'm wondering if, they were a family, and she talked about how apparently these owners kind of inherited them from their father. And so I wonder if maybe this was a family that owned them that, really wasn't a wealthy family itself, but yet they continued to care for these people even after the war.
Well, in Missouri, a lot of the plantation homes were, I don't know if I can describe it, and this was done for practicality too, but they were raised high off the ground with a big porch. But they were like two giant cabins put together, made out of logs. And then there was like a breezeway through the center. That was to circulate air in the summertime when it was hot. So a lot of the houses were big, but they were log. Now, even the brick plantation homes in Missouri, they're not what you think of when you think plantation. You think of big, white, stately mansions. These were made of bricks, handmade bricks that were made on the plantation by the slaves. Matter of fact, about 5 or 6 miles down the road from here, there's a place called Barks Plantation, and the original brick plantation home is still on the property. And it's not a huge plantation home with columns and everything you would think. It's more like a brick farmhouse. But that was your two types of plantation homes here in Missouri.
Clint, let's cut this off here, and what we're going to do is here in a minute we're going to go back and be finishing this conversation. And what we'll do is we will be recording it, obviously, and it will be a part of our next week's show, not here on TBR Radio Presents the TBR History Hour, but on TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Show. So we'll give your article a little bit of exposure over on the other show next week, Friday. Until then, I would like to encourage our listeners to go to www.foothillsmedia.net. And when you're there, you can find out all about Clint's books and different things that he has published through the years. That's a publishing company that Clint owns, foothillsmedia.net. Also go to www.barnesreview.org. Find out how you can get a copy of this current September-October 2020 issue of the Barnes Review magazine. It's over 160 pages. It's a big, huge issue full of some great articles, such as the one that we've been discussing that Clint wrote on slavery and the words of slaves, and also some other articles by myself, by Paul Angel, by John Tiffany, and by a number of other great authors. So be sure to check that out. Anyways, we are out of time, and so I am going to say goodbye, but I will be back again, same time, same place next week. Until then, From all of us here at TBR Radio, God bless.